Hi, it's Professor Streeter again, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the slideshow I made for you this week on meta-ethics. So I want to think a little bit about what the word meta adds to ethics and some of the meta-ethical positions that Schaefer-Landau explores in chapter 19 of his book, The Fundamentals of Ethics. Also in The Ethical Life, the anthology, we had three readings this week, one by David Hume, a Scottish philosopher who wrote in the 1700s, and two American, more contemporary philosophers, David Enoch and Harry Gensler. And all three of them are defending a metaphysical or a meta-ethical view. Okay. And so we'll talk about some of the main ideas here and relate them to the texts a little bit. Let me put myself in the corner of the screen, and we'll look at the first slide from the slideshow, a spectrum of meta-ethical views. We're looking at these views on a spectrum, and if you see here in the first slide, we have sort of three views: objectivism, relativism, and nihilism. And let me sort of take myself out of the picture here so we can see the whole slide. That's not working the way I wanted it to. Well, hopefully that works. Anyway, so there's sort of three basic questions that we ask in metaethics. One is, what is the basis of our moral judgments? What is their foundation? What do our moral judgments rest on? So for example, here's a claim we make to each other: murder is wrong. Well, what makes it wrong? What is that? What is the foundation of that judgment? We can think of this on analogy with scientific claims, where we make claims about a species. This animal belongs to the mammal, to the class of mammals. Well, what is the basis for a judgment like that? Right? We can give an explanation for why we think it's true to say that a whale is a mammal, even though it swims in the ocean. There's an observational scientific foundation, biological foundation for that judgment, and we can give grounds for that claim and defend it. What about ethical judgments, moral judgments? What is the basis for those kinds of claims? What is their foundation? One answer is a theistic one, right? Our moral judgments have their foundation in God, or God's will, or some belief of ours about the nature of God explains why we think that murder is wrong, or something along these lines. That's one answer. We'll look at other types of answers in this course. For example, we might think that moral judgments rest not on the nature of God, but on human nature, that the foundation of our moral judgments has something to do with truths about human nature. Okay, but that's one way of thinking about metaethics, a view about the foundation or the basis for our moral judgments. We can also ask a related question: what explains the legitimacy of our moral judgments? So it's one thing to explain where our judgments come from, what their basis is, but what gives them authority over us? Why should I think that moral rules apply to me, have some authority over me? We can ask this question with respect to local laws, right? If you live in a town and there's an ordinance that tells you can't park your truck in the driveway, you can raise a question. Well, why is that a legitimate rule, right? Why does that apply to me, right? I want to park my truck in the driveway. What harm is it doing anybody else? Why should I respect that rule? And at that point, maybe you could raise a question at the town board, right? Why is this rule in place? And maybe argue that it's a bad rule and we should change it. And if the town board can't convince you that it's a good rule, right, then you have a legitimate complaint, right? The rule might still be in place, but you could argue that it's not a legitimate rule. It doesn't really have authority over you. And you could risk, getting in trouble by breaking the rule or not. But that's a question about the legal authority of various kinds of local rules. But the claim that murder is wrong, that it's wrong to murder somebody, going back to that sort of basic example, what explains the legitimacy of that? Why don't I get to kill somebody? It's not just a matter of, the local law prohibits it, right? Where does the authority of that kind of prohibition come from? Okay. Then the third question is about the content of our judgments. What are we even talking about when we talk about morality? Are we talking about something in the world, right? When we say that the act of murder is wrong? Are we saying something about the act itself? Or are we talking about people's attitudes, right? People's emotions, people's beliefs and desires? What are we describing when we describe moral reality? Now, so there's three sort of possible views here. One is objectivism, that morality is real. There is a real basis for our moral judgments. They rest on some foundation. We can identify that. Moral judgments have authority over us, just in virtue of something about us. I don't know, that we're human, that we're rational, that we believe in God. Or, there's some basis for our moral claims, and that basis explains why they have authority over us. And moral claims tell us something true about the world, in our relationship to it. Okay, relativism. So nihilism is on the other side of the spectrum, is the view that there is no such thing as morality, right? And that might be blocked by my image, but nihilism is the view that morality is not real. There's no reality to it. It's a mere fiction. It doesn't tell us anything about the world. Moral judgments are just local rules. They don't have legitimacy or authority over those who don't acknowledge their legitimacy and authority. And they don't have a real foundation. They rest in something totally constructed or completely subjective, right? So nihilism might sound at times like relativism, but the claim is that morality doesn't really rest on anything. It's a fiction, it's a fantasy. Relativism is somewhere in the middle, right? The relativist wants to say that morality is real, but it's relative to a perspective, it's relative to a culture, to an individual. It's based on something in the culture, like it's based on customs or attitudes of individuals or groups of individuals. And what explains the legitimacy of those rules or judgments is that that group approves of them. And so what are moral judgments about for the relativist? Morality tells us something about tendencies of individuals or groups of people in terms of what they tend to approve of and disapprove of, right? And it helps us understand why people approve of some practices and not others. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. I'm having trouble moving. That's a problem. Okay, here we are. So, a spectrum of, let me make this smaller, of metaethical views. There are moral standards that apply to everyone. There are truths about what is right or wrong. And these are independent of what we happen to believe and desire from a particular perspective. That's the objectivist view that I was trying to sort of lay out here in more detail. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum is the nihilist. There are no moral standards. There are no truths about what is right or wrong. Morality is either a fiction or a pure expression of emotion or both. Okay. And then relativism is the view that there are moral standards, but they don't apply to everyone. Right? So it's not as extreme a position as the nihilist. There are moral standards, but they only apply to an individual or a group of individuals. Right? Any given moral standard, right? There's no grounds for saying that it applies to everyone. There are truths about right and wrong, but they are relative truths, right? They depend upon a particular person or the norms of a particular society or culture. And what makes moral standards legitimate? What gives them authority over us? Well, that depends on what we believe, what we happen to believe or desire or value from a particular perspective. Okay, so let's look at some examples in a moment, and that will help clarify the distinction. But there are sort of two types of relativism that Schaefer-Landau distinguishes on 295. One is what he calls pure subjectivism, where what makes an act morally acceptable is that either I approve of it, or that my commitments, what I'm committed to and how I live my life, allows for that action. Right? And then what makes an action wrong is that I either disapprove of it, or that my commitments somehow forbid or prohibit it. Right? What I'm committed to in my life somehow forbids or prohibits me from doing that. Okay? That's the purely subjectivist account of relativism, that morality depends entirely on the eye of the beholder. Much like aesthetic judgments it's just a matter of taste. What's right or wrong is simply a matter of individual taste. The cultural relativist is a more subtle view, a more nuanced view, where the moral standards are made relative to a culture, right, to the guiding ideals of a society. not just to an individual's preferences. So an act is morally acceptable just because it is allowed by the guiding ideals of society in which it's performed. And what makes something immoral is that it's forbidden or prohibited by those guiding ideals. And every culture has different guiding ideals, is the idea here. And so there will be truths about morality, but they will be relative to the guiding ideals of a society. Okay, so let's look at some examples. The first, these are sort of should statements, moral judgments, or value. Let's say not moral judgments, value judgments, claims about how you should act, or how you shouldn't act. You should eat your Wheaties. Let's start there. This is an example of a claim that what's the basis of a claim like this? What's its foundation? Well, a claim like this seems to rest entirely on a matter of taste, right? What makes it true that you should eat your Wheaties is that you enjoy eating Wheaties and that you believe that Wheaties are good for your health. Now, whether Wheaties are good for your health or not may be a more objective matter, but they're not. Wheaties are not good for everybody's health, right? Some people shouldn't eat their Wheaties because it will, maybe they have an allergy to them. But also, not everyone likes Wheaties, right? So the idea that I should eat Wheaties is, in many ways, seems almost entirely dependent on my subjective preferences. It's merely a matter of taste, right? If I say I don't like Wheaties, or Wheaties make me sick, there's no sense to be made that nevertheless I should eat them, right? So that claim only has authority over me, or it's only legitimate for me if I like Wheaties, right? If I desire them. This is sort of pointing back to Heathwood in a way. What about you should bury the dead? Look, this points to an idea about cultural relativism. Some cultures, the dead are not buried; they're burned, or they are, they're not buried whole. They are cremated, and in some cultures, they are burned and put in the water. So there are many different burial practices going back historically and today. And so to say that there's one way to do it doesn't acknowledge those cultural differences. But if in my culture the custom is to bury the dead, then that gives the practice some legitimacy, right? But if that's not the ritual, there's no sense in which I should do it. That kind of claim is relative to a culture. The second two examples are the ones that seem to be more objective, right? The idea that you should keep your promises seems on the face of it to be something that is not dependent on your personal preferences and not dependent in the same way on cultural practices and norms. That's an open question, right? Also, women should enjoy the same basic rights as men. Not every cultures agree with that, but it seems like there's an argument to be made that that's a kind of moral standard that applies across cultures. And so both of these claims seem to have more of an objective commitment. Right? We're not just saying that you should keep your promises because you want to, but because it's right, independently of what you want or something. And we're not just saying that women should enjoy the same basic rights as men because that's the custom around here, because that reflects the guiding ideals of a society, because it's not true. It's not true that every society has that as an ideal. It's making a more objective claim, claiming that there's a kind of moral truth here that goes across cultures, right? That is independent of cultural perspective. Okay, so these are examples that I hope get you to think about the different metaethical views, right? Now you might think that all moral judgments, all moral rules are kind of like you should bury the dead. It depends on the culture where you live. On the other hand, you might think that some moral rules give us reason to think that there are objective moral truths, like, I don't know, women should enjoy the same basic rights as men. That's an example of something that looks on the face of it to be independent of a particular cultural perspective. At least that's what morality claims, that there are moral truths that are kind of apply across cultures. Okay, I've run out of time, so I'm going to pause here, and maybe we can pick this up again in class next week. But you can finish the rest of the slideshow. Kind of walks you through some of the problems with ethical relativism. Actually, I think I'm going to make one more video where I walk you through some of the attractions and the problems with ethical relativism. Okay.